Welcome to our Near-Death Experience interview series. I'm Robert Mays. Suzanne and I have researched near-death experiences, NDEs, for the past 15 years. We're currently interviewing people who have had an NDE and who have also received visions of future world events. The interviews are part of our research project, which was approved by the Academic and Research Committee of IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. In these interviews, we're exploring NDErs' insights into the deeper meaning of the challenges currently facing humanity, such as the pandemic, the current social and economic challenges, and the political polarization of our society. What advice do NDErs have for coping with and responding to these challenges?
Today we are speaking with Rabbi Stephen Robbins of Congregation Neve Shalom in Los Angeles. Stephen is also a clinical psychologist with a specialty in the psychoneuroimmunology of trauma, bringing together the spiritual, the physical, and brain development in helping patients respond to trauma. Stephen has had a total of 7 NDEs in his life, beginning with his birth. His most recent NDE was last May on his 76th birthday, not as a result of COVID, but from a life-threatening condition. He was comatose with blood clots in his left lung, left leg, pneumonia, and massive organ failure. He miraculously survived and is with us today. Welcome, Rabbi Robbins.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to participate with you in this research project.
Great, thank you. Stephen, can you describe your first NDE when you were born on May 7th, 1944?
I was not born. I was removed from my mother's body dead. It was the doctor who, I'll describe in a minute, breathed life back into me. And that was the beginning of what turned into many NDEs, as well as many catastrophic surgeries, 13 of them. And at the same time, many OBEs and STEs as a result of the spirituality of being born dead. In 1969, I went to see the doctor who delivered me. I was very curious because my mother's statements about being born a blue baby never really made any sense to me, because my deeper consciousness kept replaying for me what had happened in the womb and even before I entered my body and then being born dead. So when I went to see the doctor, who was an OBGYN and approximately my mother's age, he said to me, Rabbi Robbins, where's your wife? And I said, I really came to talk to you about me. I'm not married yet. So he looked at me and said, what can I do for you? I said, on May 7th, 1944, and he jumped out of his chair and backed up against the wall, and he pointed at me and he said, you're that baby. And then he came back and he sat down and he said, you are with me every day of my life. I was astounded. I said, please explain to me. Because my experience tells me that you were the one that gave me life. and he looked so shocked. He said, I was a naval surgeon in the Pacific, and I was so severely wounded in a kamikaze attack that they were amazed with the surgeries that I died and came back several times. And finally, when I survived, I was so wounded that they mustered me out in 1944. My first position was as OBGYN at Queen of Angels Hospital in Los Angeles. He said, I felt that my near-death experiences and the return were to show me the wonders of what it would be like to not be in this world, and that sending me back was a punishment because of all of the lives I couldn't save, of the men who were brought to me so torn apart by war. And the first call I received was to deliver a child on May 7th, 1944, at around 6 o'clock in the evening. And I felt that this was an opportunity for my redemption. If I could bring life into the world, then it meant that my life would be given the opportunity to repair all the damage I had done. And so I was filled with great hope. And when I arrived, the birth had already begun, and your birth was extraordinarily difficult. You were breech. We had to push you back in and finally pulled you out feet first. And by the time you were coming out, your body was white and flaccid. We could detect no heartbeat. And by the time we removed you, we saw that the umbilical cord had been wrapped around your neck several times and that you had been strangled to death in the uterus. As the nurse was carrying you away to register you as stillborn, something was entered me, and a voice said to me, you must make this child live. And without control of my own hands, I reached forward and I took you from the nurse, and being directed, I held you in my arms, my one hand under your back, another on your chest. I began to massage it, and then I leaned forward and I began to breathe into your nose and mouth. Of course, the nurses and the other doctors in the room looked at me like I'd gone crazy. Nobody interrupted me. And eventually, I don't know how long it was, I felt you inhale as I exhale, and then I felt you exhale as I inhale, and we breathed together for a few breaths, and then I pulled away, and you opened your eyes, and instead of crying, you had this enormously peaceful look in your face, and I looked into your eyes, and in this newborn infant, this newly brought to life, dead infant, I saw the oldest, wisest, and kindest eyes that I had ever seen. And then he pointed at me and he said, I now see those same eyes. So you are that baby. My experience, unlike most infants who are born without any prenatal memories, I was not born or brought into the world with infant amnesia. I remember everything that happened from the moment of the creation of my soul and its descent into my body to the strangulation in the uterus and my soul being taken away to being returned to its source and then being breathed into by the doctor so that my soul was returned to me. In the surprise, the astonishment of being a unique soul, separated from the totality of God's being, there was both astonishment and awe, this great surprise. I felt fear and I felt ecstasy. And I was told that I was to become a soul that would go into the physical world and that I had tasks to perform that I would be informed of as my soul went through the stages of development until it entered my body. Accompanying me were what in common terms would be angelic beings and the souls of ancestors of mine, either from my family descent line or from a spiritual descent line, who shared with me their common goals and work that they did that I was supposed to continue. One of them included my great-grandfather, Avram Yosef Luria, who lived in Kasrilov in the late 1800s, and who was informed that a great beast was coming to devour the Jews of Eastern Europe, and that he was to teach his youngest child, who was his daughter, who became my grandmother, all that he knew, and that she was to go to America. She would meet a man, they would marry. That daughter of hers would have 2 sons, and the first of them would be the vessel of his knowledge and his connection to the rest of the family. The Luria family, as rabbis and mystics and healers, go way back to the 1400s and in southern Spain and in Western Europe. Without going through the history, when I became a soul, these beings, these angelic beings, which in Hebrew the word malach, which is erroneously translated as angel, really means a messenger. And they are authorities of the divine who are to carry messages to the soul and to the world of things that are happening and coming and things that the soul are to do, which is called a tikkun. It is the way in which each soul that comes into the world is not by accident, but by purpose. That each of us, excuse me a moment, that each of us fills a spot in the incomplete existence which is constantly unfolding. And our role is to either take something out of the world which no longer belongs, or to bring something into the world which is new and it needs, or sometimes to do both. And as I was condensed from this great unlimited spiritual consciousness, the descent into the infant fetus was a matter of compaction, and in each stage of the compaction becoming more physical. There was pain, but there was also learning about what it meant to be a soul living in the physical being, in the physical world. And when I finally entered my infant being in that uterus, I understood something that I learned later from the Zohar, and that is that the body is a shoe for the soul's foot. In other words, there is only a small part of our total soul, our consciousness, which is present here in the body. Periodically, it gets refreshed, but it has its limitations because the physical body and its senses and its intellectual and emotional capacities are limited by the physical. In each of my NDEs, I experienced the leaving of this physical being and the expansion of my consciousness, my attachment to my root soul, each of which involved viewing myself out of my body, being carried by my guides, by my what we call shomrim, my watchers, who would aid me in the passage of life review and the healing of whatever damage I had done, and more importantly, the work that was yet left for me to do. And in each of these, I was given clear messages about things that were coming. In this first descent into the world, as I entered the third stage of the compaction of the soul, I was told that I was going to experience a bright, intense light that seemed to rip the universe open, and that it was that man had finally found a way to destroy everything that God had made. And one of the things I remember and experienced was the atomic bombs at the end of World War II.
Yeah.
And I have felt that ripping light and the power of humanity to destroy itself for the sake of its own needs for power.
Yes. So Stephen, just to orient people to the timing here, your vision of this bright, huge flash of light and the fabric of the world being torn apart was in May 7th, 1944. And so that was like a year and 2 months before actually the first atomic explosion in Los Alamos. That was July 1945. And then the two atomic bombs were exploded a month after that in August 1945 on Japan. So this was a year and 2 months beforehand that you saw this and understood what that meant.
Yes. In the vision of the future, there was no statement about a bomb and the war. There was only this clear understanding that humans had finally found a way to take this vast earth that had been given to us to manage, to tend like a garden, and had taken it and taken its possession in a way that proved that we could ultimately destroy the earth and all of humanity.
Stephen, when you talked about your guides or watchers, can you, in as best you can, in your own words, describe a little bit more about what they look like and what you experienced with them, and what did they teach you?
When I met's the wrong term, when I experienced those beings that accompanied me through the process of becoming a soul, you don't see them in the terms of physical vision. because once we leave the body, the need for those terms disappears. And so we experience the presence of others, and it is the experience of presence that's important, especially those of us who've had NDEs know that ultimately that what we see physically is a projection of what we hope to see or expect to see when we die. And that if they go farther past the NDE, those visions turn into experience with the expansion of consciousness. My quote, messengers, angelic beings, were, of course, beings of light. They had no form, no shape, because I did not either. And yet there was this great love pouring from them into me as an expression of the love of the Holy One, which was to be with me throughout my life, telling me that I'm never alone, that why I might experience emotional or physical aloneness and illness, that in truth, all I had to do was focus back on the forming of my soul and the role of these angelic messengers to transform me with love, not with pain, not with suffering, but with a deep sense of meaning and purpose. And as we descended more and more into physical shape, these beings of light began to take on human-like form. Of course, the difference between humans and angels, it says again in Zohar, is that humans have feet and angels have wings. In the first description of death with Jacob in Egypt, it says that Jacob lifted his feet off the floor, upon the bed, and there his soul left. And so all of the angelic beings I've experienced had no feet, and wings are a human term to their capacity to move by will without the need for motion of any kind. The wings become something that is the way of describing their motion.
So
at the same time, I experienced my ancestors who shared with me their past lives and what it was of their work that I was to do here. And there are many of them. Most of them I won't name because they appear to be so important in the unfolding of Jewish experience and of mystical experience for all humanity that I don't want to sound like I'm being arrogant. Suffice it to say that they go back to the beginning of humanity and the formation of the first human. And so each of us has a spark of the first human, and that spark is spread throughout all of us, so that for all of us, the presence of God's name is what forms us. And the four letters of God's name fill our bodies, and it creates a spiritual skeleton which sustains us. These beings, by the time I was implanted in the fetus near the time of birth, placed me gently into this body with both great love and great sorrow, because I was told there that I would experience great suffering and also great ecstasy in my life, and that each of those would be mine to teach to others to help them cope with the powerful stresses and fears that would enter their life, and that my task was to help people live without fear.
So in moving ahead very quickly to your sixth NDE, to kind of develop this idea, in your sixth NDE, that was in January 2018,
Yes,
you were given a message to deliver to the IANDS Board of Directors, International Association for Near-Death Studies, their Board of Directors, about helping people overcome their fear of death. Can you tell us more about that?
in that NDE, the experience was totally befuddling to the doctors because I had come in with my heart stopped and I was not breathing. And when they tried to intubate me, my hand came up and pushed the tube away twice. And then they all heard me say to them, "Don't do that to me. You'll hurt me, you'll kill me." And of course, I wasn't speaking physically, but I was speaking from the place where I was at the edge of leaving and not returning. And at that point, I was given the message, among many others, that IANDS was the one platform which, given all of its incredible knowledge, both personal and scientific, about near-death experience, provided a platform to teach about near-death and death experiences that would alleviate humanity's fear of death, because there is no death. There is only the leaving of the constraint of the physical and beginning to enter into the expanded experience of being pure consciousness, pure soul.
Right.
And as I came to learn about IANDS, I met Dennis Purcell, who has since passed from this world. And Dennis, when he heard my story, asked me to present to the LA chapter of IANDS. And after that, two of them, one of them in which a man who had been at the end of his transit, I came to bless him, and his soul called me there to stand next to him and to tell him to return to the world, which he did. And I prayed that the Holy One would reverse the sentence. And he has returned, and he lived a full life. He is now since passed, but since he returned, his teaching to people has been profound. So in that message, I learned to refine the concept. And when Susan Amsden and Chuck Swedrock heard the message that I was given, Chuck asked me to address the IANDS board, which I did, and told them that IANDS could be the beginning of the change from the fear of death. It was not about a theology. It was not about a religion. It was not about some standard of religious observance. But since it is the generic experience of humans who've made the transit once to several times, and since it was about the scientific response to studying these, even by doctors, scientists, psychiatrists, etc., who had themselves their own NDE and had been transformed by them, that this knowledge could begin to alleviate people's fear of death. And once the fear of death began to diminish, the amount of actions which we would call evil would also diminish, because evil, the meaning of evil in the ancient Hebrew word means disruption. So it means to take apart that which has been put together. It is the reason why we are experiencing all of these potential life-taking disasters, from COVID to climate change to the political disruption. All of it that's going on is all informing us that we are the only beings that have the power of redemption, and that it is we who have to rise up as a whole, not in a political movement, but in this clear movement of commitment to living, commitment to this earth as the place from which our souls are educated and then rise to serve God at higher and higher levels.
Yes, I'd like to interject here a couple of points. Thank you. First of all, the loss of fear of death is quite common. About 90% of near-death experiencers report that they have lost the fear of death, 90%. So nearly NDER says that they have lost the fear of death. And given that estimate, or rather given an estimate of the number of people who have had an NDE, that's at least 300 million people in the world who have lost their fear of dying. So this is an important message just of NDErs. They have lost the fear of death because they have experienced that we don't die, that actually leaving the physical body is an experience that's clear to them, that their essence is not part of the physical body, and that we don't die. So that's one of the things I wanted to point out. The other is that you mentioned Chuck Swedrock and Susan Amsden. They are both part of they're both on the board of IANS at the moment. So yeah.
And Chuck began the ISGO program of opening up IANS in Zoom format for people to come and participate and learn about their own NDEs, because most people who have them never talk about them. They're afraid that people will think they're crazy. Even the doctors and the scientists who've had them won't talk about them, again, because of their fear. But if there is this huge universal voice that goes around the world in different languages, in different religions, in different economic and educational status, the millions of people, even in the United States, who can begin to be relieved of fear, will be able to deal with all of the experiences which generate terror in our life. Yeah. Because we will all know that we don't die, that the soul, the being, is eternal and infinite, and that we are only a spark of God's presence, that we are not an independent ego floating around humanity, trying to take as much as it can in order to somehow stave off death.
So Stephen, the world situation that we're in right now, all the many crises on all different fronts of human life, the message that comes from NDErs that we don't die when the body dies, and that we continue to exist, there's implied in that is that there is a spiritual reality, and that's in a distinction between what the general view of most people in the world is, that the only reality is the material reality, the physical. Yes. So is the message then, said in another way, the healing message of NDEs is that in order for there to be any real turnaround in the world, a real healing in the world, is that we have to overcome materialism. That is really the source of our illness in the world.
Yes, that's absolutely correct, Suzanne. The the need to gather and to hold in order to fill the emptiness that generates the fear makes us feel that somehow we have fulfilled ourselves, when in fact it only embeds us more and more in the limitations of the physical. Here in my training in brain science and trauma, we live in an educational system that is basically left brain oriented. It is rational, structured. It is based upon doing skills. Most of the right brain is ignored and even denigrated. I've had doctors, scientists who have all had that expression, and when they've had an NDE and they speak with me and I can demonstrate quickly how their mind is so left brain that they walk around like this, and suddenly they perceive the right brain, this part of themselves, which is by science, psychological, emotional, experiential, and the right brain has no sense of time. So that when a trauma happens, the right prefrontal orbital cortex, that's the brain right behind the eye, contains identity, your hologram of your own sense of being. And when that is challenged, either by an illness or by an experience or by some process of non-attachment or love, it destabilizes the development of your identity in your brain, so that when trauma happens, the brain causes dissociation so that the left side of the brain literally shuts down. There are MRIs of that. And the right brain sequesters the trauma, trying to hide it. But the trauma leaks out when there are reminders that we've had it. Those are called PTSD memories or flashbacks. My experience of them is that you go back into the original trauma, and what the neurobiology shows is that the cascade of all of the brain chemistry that was the result of the original trauma is constantly repeated over and over again, so that it destabilizes your pituitary hypothalamus, which then destabilizes your autonomic nervous system, your adrenals, and which destabilizes your autoimmune system, and so that, which then destabilizes your pituitary hypothalamus, and it goes round and round in a circle until you end up with a hypervigilant adrenal response and a hypervigilant autoimmune response, until eventually, unless the traumas are released, you can develop autoimmune disease. I hope that helps. Learning the spirituality of consciousness, to know that consciousness is not in the brain, but surrounds it, that the consciousness uses the construct of the brain to be able to conceptualize and then verbalize what the experience is truncated by the way in which we limit the development of the right brain, which is, in truth, the dominant hemisphere of the brain until the end of puberty, which means that we lock inner development out and focus only on satisfying the expectations for performance, which generates great anxiety and fear of having to be perfect.
Yeah. Stephen, we are about out of time. And I think what we'd like to do is continue this discussion in another session. So
Yeah.
If that's okay with you, I think we'll stop the recording now, and we'll we'll schedule another interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you.